Our life was simple, but I always thought Laura and I were content. We lived in a small house in the suburbs, where everyone knew the neighbors. I worked as a manager at a local company, and Laura ran her own jewelry store. We didn't have much money, but we always found a way to make ends meet. We had plans to save up for a trip to Europe, to renovate the kitchen, and maybe even to think about having children. My heart was calm because I thought our marriage was on a solid foundation. But there was always Henry in our lives. He lived across the street in a luxurious mansion that looked like something out of a magazine. His yard was always perfectly manicured, the cars in the driveway shined, and Henry himself was always impeccably dressed. He was a rich, confident man, and he seemed so out of reach for all of us who lived ordinary lives. Henry often organized parties to which he invited his neighbors, and although we were not close, he always seemed friendly. Laura often talked about Henry. She praised his taste, his successes, even his magnificent garden. "Have you seen his new car? It's a work of art," she would say one night at dinner. I nodded, not attaching much importance to it. People like to admire what they don't have. But over time, these conversations began to seem too frequent to me. I noticed Laura changing. She began to spend more time in front of the mirror, choosing clothes that emphasized her beauty. She was leaving the house more often, explaining that she was meeting friends or running errands. When I asked her about these trips, she answered quickly and as if by the way, as if she didn't want me to go into details. One evening, Henry invited us to dinner. Laura was delighted. "This is an opportunity to see how successful people live," she said. I wasn't thrilled, but I agreed because I didn't want to upset her. The dinner was fabulous. Dishes I couldn't even pronounce, expensive wines, and brilliant conversations. Laura looked like she was in a fairy tale. She was laughing at Henry's jokes, looking at him with a certain sparkle in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time, and I felt something shrink inside me. After that dinner, I started to pay more attention to how she interacted with Henry. They often exchanged jokes when they saw each other on the street, and sometimes I noticed her notifications on her phone, which she quickly closed when I approached. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that I was just jealous. But my intuition told me that something was wrong. It all looked like nothing until one day I saw them together. It happened by accident. I was coming home from work earlier than usual and saw Henry driving Laura to our house. They were discussing something animatedly, laughing, and Laura looked overly excited. I stood at a distance while they said goodbye. Henry leaned over to her, and even though it was a brief moment, I felt my heart clench. That day was the beginning of the end of my peace. I didn't know what would happen next, but I could feel that something was crumbling and I would have to face the truth, no matter how bitter it was. After that situation at the house, I couldn't find peace. Something inside me was screaming that this was not just a friendly conversation. I tried to convince myself that it was jealousy, but the price I was paying for those doubts was too high. Laura acted as if nothing had happened. She was friendly. She laughed and talked about her daily routine, but I could feel a distance forming between us. One evening, on my way home from work, I saw Laura getting out of Henry's car. She looked nervous. Her hair was disheveled, and she was holding a bag that hadn't been there before. I stopped in front of the house and asked, "What was that?" She flinched, but answered quickly, "Oh, Henry just gave me a ride from the store. I was buying something for dinner." Her voice sounded too calm for someone who had just met me by chance. I didn't say anything, but it was another wake-up call. The next day, I decided not to go to work. I told Laura I wasn't feeling well and stayed home. She looked a little surprised, but didn't ask too many questions. I wanted to see what her day looked like without me. At lunchtime, I heard her talking on the phone in the next room. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Yes, I can come at 3. "No, he doesn't know anything. Just be careful," she said. Then she stopped talking and left the house. I stood there, unable to move. Her words echoed in my head. I decided to follow her. She went to Henry's house. She didn't knock, didn't ring the doorbell. She just opened it and went inside. My heart was beating faster than ever. I walked closer, trying to remain unnoticed. I looked through the window and saw them. They were sitting together on the couch, drinking wine and laughing. Her hand was on his knee. That evening I did not make a scandal. I wanted more evidence to be sure that it wasn't just my imagination. Over the next few days, I began to observe her. Laura was becoming more and more distant, finding excuses to leave the house and often returning late. I knew it wasn't work or friends. I found her phone when she went to the shower. I knew it was wrong, but I needed to know the truth. Opening the messenger, I saw the correspondence with Henry. Their messages were filled with jokes, compliments, and hints that left no room for doubt. "You were incredible yesterday. I can't wait to see you again," was one of his last messages. My hands were shaking as I read it. I had no more doubts. This was not just flirting. It was a betrayal. That evening I decided to talk to her. When she came home, I was waiting for her in the living room. "We need to talk," I said, and she immediately realized that something was wrong. Her face turned pale, and she sat down across from me, folding her hands in her lap. "I know what's going on between you and Henry," I said bluntly. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't deny it. "It's not what you think," she began, but I stopped her. "You don't have to lie. I saw you. I read your messages." She fell silent. The room fell into an oppressive silence. My heart was broken, but I knew I needed an answer. "Why?" Her answer was quiet, almost inaudible. I started to feel unnoticed. "He gives me something you don't." Her words sounded like a stab in the back. It was the moment when I realized that our marriage could not be saved. After that conversation with Laura, I felt like the whole world had collapsed. The betrayal was not only a breach of trust, but also a humiliation. I knew this man, my neighbor. Henry had always looked like a model of success, but now I saw him as an enemy who had taken what I thought was mine. Laura moved into another room. We hardly spoke, and our home became a silent battlefield. Every look, every sound reminded me of what had happened. She tried to act as if everything could still be saved, but I could see that her thoughts were not with me. She continued to visit Henry even after I found out about their affair. I tried to find a way to regain control. Work became my escape. My colleagues noticed that I looked depressed, but I didn't want to share my problems. I felt like I had to keep it to myself. Every time I saw Henry on the street or his car outside my house, the anger inside me grew. But I didn't want to make a scene. One evening I decided to talk to Henry. It was a step I hadn't been able to take for a long time, but I couldn't take it anymore. I went to his door and rang the bell. He opened it, and the same confident expression I hated appeared on his face. "We need to talk," I said coldly. He invited me inside, not even trying to hide his arrogance. Everything in his living room was perfect, just like him. This only made me angrier. "What do you want, Alex?" he asked, sitting down on his luxurious sofa. His tone was as casual as ever. "What are you doing with my wife?" I asked bluntly. My hands clenched into fists, but I tried to keep my composure. "She came to me on her own," he replied calmly. "And if you want to know the truth, Alex, I'm just giving her what you couldn't." His words were like a knife to my heart. I realized that trying to convince him of anything was a futile exercise. He was confident in his superiority, and this only fueled my anger. I stood up, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "This is not over." Then I walked away, leaving him sitting there with that same smile on his face. I came home and saw Laura sitting in the living room. She looked exhausted, but I couldn't sympathize anymore. I packed my things and decided to move to a hotel for a while. I couldn't stay in the house that now reminded me of her betrayal. Those few days at the hotel were hard. I spent nights without sleep, thinking about what to do next. My life had become chaos, and I didn't know how to get out of it. But one thought kept coming back. I had to take action. I couldn't let them destroy me. I went to a lawyer to prepare the divorce papers. It was a difficult decision, but I knew there was no other way. Laura tried to talk to me, but I no longer listened to her excuses. In my eyes, she had become a stranger. At that time, I started working on myself. I started going to the gym, spending more time with friends I hadn't seen for a long time. They supported me and gave me the strength to move on. My life slowly but surely began to gain new momentum. I knew there would be many difficulties ahead, but I was ready for them. Henry could take my wife, but he could not take my spirit. I decided that I would not let this situation break me. The decision to file for divorce was a turning point for me. I was no longer clinging to the past and was ready to leave Laura and everything that was connected with her betrayal. The lawyer helped me to draw up a clear plan, and for the first time in a long time, I felt that I had control over the situation. However, Laura was not going to let go so easily. She tried to convince me that we could fix it. Alex, I made a mistake, but we've been together for so many years. You can't just ruin everything like this, she said with tears in her eyes. But there was no room for her in my heart anymore. The real drama unfolded at the next stage, the division of property. Laura decided that if I did not stay with her, I would at least leave her the house. She insisted that this was her right because she put her soul into our common space. There was another participant in this conflict, Henry. I found out that he started to advise Laura on legal issues. It looked like another attempt to show me who was boss. I was ready to fight. We met in court, and it was a battle not only for property but also for my dignity. Laura tried to make me look like a cruel person who was leaving her in the lurch, but my lawyers did their job. Their strategy was clear: show that I had always acted in the best interests of our marriage while Laura betrayed my trust. I remained calm during the hearing, but every word she said hit me like a hammer. She tried to convince the court that Henry was just a friend who was helping her through a difficult time. But when the lawyer presented evidence of their relationship, messages, photos, testimonies from neighbors, everything fell into place. Her lies fell apart like a house of cards. The judge ruled in my favor. I got the house and most of our joint property. It was not only a victory, but also a symbol that I was back in control of my life. Laura was crushed, but I no longer felt any anger or pity for her. She had made her choice, and now she was reaping the rewards. Henry seemed to have lost interest in Laura as well. After the trial, I didn't see him around her anymore. Perhaps he realized his game was up, or he just decided to find a new pastime. In any case, I was glad that this chapter of my life was closed. When I returned home after the trial, I sat down in my backyard and for the first time in a long time felt really relieved. Everything I had been through had strengthened me. I decided that I would never let anyone destroy my trust and self-respect again. I started building a new life. I invested money in renovating my house, started spending more time with friends, and even allowed myself to think about new relationships. The past was just a lesson I learned. Never let someone use you, and always fight for yourself. After all the trials and tribulations, I finally began to feel that life was returning to normal. The court battles were over. Laura no longer occupied my thoughts, and the house I loved so much was a symbol of a new beginning. My life changed. I started to pay more attention to myself. Every day, I built something new, whether in my home or in my soul. I enrolled in financial literacy courses to better understand how to manage my money. I started going to the gym and running. Every day I felt myself getting stronger, not only physically, but also mentally. I also started to open myself up to new people. One day at a party with friends, I met a woman named Elizabeth. She was smart, independent, and had that calm look that immediately inspired my trust. We started talking, and it was completely different from what I had experienced with Laura. With Elizabeth, everything was simple and sincere. We started spending more time together. She understood my past, but didn't ask too many questions. She supported me in my endeavors, and I felt that I could trust her again. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to be happy. Laura tried to come back into my life. She wrote several messages apologizing and saying that she wanted to fix everything. But I had already gone down that road. Her words no longer had power over me. I replied briefly, "It's over. Good luck to you." Henry, I learned later, sold his house and moved away. Apparently, his perfect life had cracked too. I didn't think about him anymore. For me, it was just an episode that taught me to value myself and my limits. One evening, I was sitting in my yard with Elizabeth. We watched the sun go down and talked about the future. I realized that my life was now filled not only with plans, but also with hope. "You know, you've changed a lot," she said, smiling. "Yes, I have," I replied, holding her hand. "And this is just the beginning.